So thank you both for a very interesting talk, and now we're going to have an interesting conversation, hopefully. There was a couple of things that stood out for me in relation to things that you both came up with. Something that I thought was really interesting was the importance of mindset and your own mental models. And how do you become aware of those, and how do you kind of bring them to consciousness to others as well that you're working with? Because it's really important, as you were both saying. So, we thought.
Yeah, I can start. Is this on?
Yes.
It's not easy. It took, throughout my PhD, I only realised a few years in what these kind of things actually meant, and then reflecting on what I'd done earlier, realised that I was doing these things because it's invisible. It's very hard to understand it because you've never experienced something outside of that, and particularly when people around you say and think similar things, it's very, very difficult. I think for me, what helped me understand that was probably living overseas for a while. Because that's a serious life lesson of seeing people that think slightly differently to you, and the world, their whole environment, everything is just slightly different, and you're trying to work out why that is. But there's little differences. Yeah.
It's a great question, Jax. I ran a workshop last week about worldviews with a colleague from the Institute of Sustainable Futures, Katie Ross, and who knows a lot more about worldviews and changing worldviews than I do. And she talked about the idea of disorientating experiences. So probably moving overseas is a disorientating experiences when what we are experiencing is not in line with the way we're looking at the world. And I've had a couple of those experiences. One was, I think traditionally my worldview was more in that scientific, Newtonian, Cartesian worldview, quite black and white, hierarchical way of thinking about the world. I really loved physics and mathematics at school, and in my family everyone loves those things as well, and we all love to play chess. We didn't talk a lot about emotions and stuff like that. And one of my first really disorientating experiences was when I started engaging with the health system. So I had some health issues, and I realized that the medical sciences actually didn't have answers to all my issues. Like, I was dealing with a really great specialist, but when I asked him what he was doing, and I was like, I have all these scientific papers here with all these statistics, but he said, well, yeah, but you're a unique case, and I'm just using my expertise. So that's the first kind of disorientating experience that I had, where I realized that, it's great that we have medical science that have really progressed through it, but there's only so much we can do with it. Now, of course, it's hard to, you wouldn't strategically go get an experience like that. And another experience I had, which I think is more relevant in this context, is when I joined the Faculty of Transdisciplinary Innovation here 2.5 years ago, which has been a really great disorientating experience. Before that, I kind of looked at, you have design and you have your complex societal problems, and then you just impose design on those problems, and then it will all get better. And I did experience that it wasn't really working that way. But then I started working in transdisciplinary innovation, and one of the great things is, well, we have lots of different students, but we also have lots of different staff. So being surrounded by very diverse people, our dean is a typographer. She designs font, and our deputy dean is a forensic scientist, and my course director is a novelist. She writes books, and in my team I have an accountant and an educationalist and a social entrepreneur. So they're all very different. And then you realize that what we're doing in design is actually, firstly, not that unique. So we talk about being human-centered, but a lot of disciplines are human-centered, maybe apart from science. But most disciplines really try to understand humans. So we often talk about how we use stories. But my colleagues in communications and journalism, they really laugh if we say that Yeah, the other, and what helps is that we've developed very strong relations where we can actually be each other's critical friend. So it's great to have diverse people, but you need people to confront you with the way you're thinking, and I definitely have that in my faculty. That sometimes I say something, and then a colleague comes to me and says, "Well, Mieke, maybe you could think about this in a different way." So that combination of diversity and having this critical friend relationship, I find very, very useful. Because like Tim's saying, it's very hard. You can't just think about, oh, what's my worldview today? Like, do I need to change it? It just doesn't work like that.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the floor. Who would like to ask a question? Really? Okay.
I'll ask a question.
Would you mind coming up? Yeah.
Coming up there?
Yeah.
All right.
I think so, why not? Recording. I'll be able to see the face. Thanks.
Hi guys. My question is, like Tim, you mentioned that and I've experienced this as well, when you're trying to model a system or diagram a system, it can quickly get to the point where everything's connected to everything else. And then you kind of blew my mind again when you started giving the voice to like the projector and the train, and I'm like, crap, now I have to do all this extra research that I don't even know how to interview these things. So, like, do you have any tips for kind of like wrangling the just sheer interconnectedness? I mean, and then especially if you're worried that your own mindset is going to be the thing that helps you edit, like, is that really, like, how do you navigate that sort of, getting it to where it fits on a page, or getting a system view that is useful versus overwhelming?
Well, there's probably, thanks Alex.
Lean in the microphone. You're a little quiet up the back.
He has a microphone.
I can bring it closer.
Yes. Thank you.
Undone too many buttons.
Yeah, well, I think pragmatism, like as an example. So thinking about what the thing that I'm making, or what representation I'm making, who is the audience that this is for, and what is the message like that I'm trying to convey with this. So it is art, really. Like, what is the right level? Like, there's concrete, abstract, there's detail, simple. It's okay to have multiple representations for different audiences if you think that that's going to be more compelling. I mean, the advantage of doing a PhD, but also disadvantage, is that you have an enormous amount of time to think about what a projector says. But you do think about that in the process of making those artifacts, as I'm sure you know, that you're constantly editing and thinking, well, what is the hierarchy of information here? What is the most important thing to include? And constantly trying to second guess how that user is going to experience that, and even what worldview that they're going to have when they look at it as to what they're going to see. So in that sense, you're kind of writing a script for how that thing is going to be used, and you have an anticipation of how you think that person's going to read that script, and if it's going to hit the right level. So if you're a very good designer, it'll always hit the right level. But you need to know the audience very well in order to do that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Can I ask it from here?
Yes.
If I have the mic?
Sure.
I just want to, like, fly a kite. A test example past you guys for some feedback. So I'm involved in a project seeking to introduce more affordable housing into the market, and I'm working for an organisation called Sydney Alliance on their housing team. They use a model of community organising to develop their projects, right? So that's something, that we use in trying to achieve this, and ultimately to influence government decisions. Now, if you look at the housing market, it is a complex system because there's so many things that have an influence on housing prices. But I'm just going to take one example, and that was negative gearing that was introduced by Paul Keating about 20 odd years ago. His purpose was to allow new people like, you know, say young people, for example, just entering into the market, to give them a pathway into the housing market so they could negative gear their property and maybe invest in another one. But what happened, it wasn't his intention, but the market got hold of that and certain people started to, if you like, abuse that intention. And so negative gearing has had the result that a lot of, you know, wealthy investors have hijacked it, and it's no longer achieving the purpose that it was set out to do. So that's the problem. It's only part of the whole system, but like if we just take one problem. And so as a way to investigate that and come up with solutions, I came up with this model, which is partly why I was interested in that, and I called it fluid systems design. So the idea of a fluid system is that it can quickly adapt, you know, so it's sensitive to what's happening in the environment, a whole lot of different factors in the environment. So it's evolutionary, and it can adapt to that, what's happening out there, so that in turn you can make adjustments to the model so that you're more likely to stay on the track where you're aiming to hit. So that's my kite, and if you guys have got any comment on that as an approach, or you know, ideas that you might know of where people have tried to tackle those sort of problems or whatever.
So affordable housing is a great example of a complex problem, and it's very common across cities across the world. We see that a lot of cities are becoming the victims of their own success. So there's no easy answer to this question. What I'd recommend to do is just, you know, engage with people who are doing this kind of work. So, so I just spent some time with Mars Solutions Lab in Canada, which is not nearby, I realize that. I'm sure there's partners in Australia as well. They're also looking at, you know, the city level and how we can address complex societal problems. And first of all, I think, you know, Tim already talked about, you know, the different lenses. So, you know, we can say, well, the negative gearing, that's the financial lens. If we look at Donella Meadows' leverage points for intervening in systems, that's the most shallow level, I think. That's, you know, changing parameters, so changing taxes or subsidies, those kind of things. And it'd be interesting to look at other ways. I don't think this is an easy problem to address at all, and I definitely think it's something that's, you know, that requires experimentation and learning from each other and getting into those learning loops. Because there is no answer. I mean, we can get rid of negative gearing, but it's not going to solve affordable housing either, because there's so many other factors at play as well. So yeah, I think it's all about you know, engaging with people who have different types of expertise when it comes to these things, and really thinking about, you know, who you can partner with. You have anything to say about that, Tim?
Not really, but when you start to think about these systems, sometimes it helps just to draw pictures of them. Mm-hmm. So there's some examples like Checklin's rich picture. Fan of the fans. That's the fan. Which helps you kind of start thinking about things in that systemic way. So you just literally draw everything you think of when you think of that problem, and then what's most important is that you draw yourself in relation to that problem. So whether you think you're inside it or outside of it, and start to kind of formulate, what is my perspective, and do other people have that same perspective or not? And I've done that in lots of workshops where there'll be a bunch of different people who think they're talking about the same thing. But then through this little exercise, you can quickly have a conversation and say, actually, well, we all care about different parts of this problem. But yeah, something as complex as affordable housing, I think there's an enormous amount of people thinking about that problem right now, and you can probably find like-minded people who are already established and doing something about it in a way that you think is the most effective or the way you want to explore it.
Yeah.
Hey, I just thank you so much, by the way. It's been really interesting talks. I've really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you about solving complex problems using the experimental framework in people's heads, where you basically run experiments on your complex problem by conversations with people who are embedded in those systems and who have kind of a simulation of that system in their mind. My background is working with startups, primarily hardware startups. So sort of on the Cynefin framework, we're often in looking at complex and complicated problems, and we do build, measure, learn loops for experimentation, very similar to the probe, sense, react. With hardware startups in particular, it's really hard to build the thing before you get to the point where you can experiment a lot. So we do a lot of questioning and talking to people. It's not something I've heard about a lot. Done some human-centered design where you're asking questions of people and you ask, the 5 whys and you get deep in them. But having sort of more of an interactive conversation where you're utilising their understanding of the system, where they get to run a simulation almost of your product in the environment they're familiar with. Have you done much work in that sense? Can you point me in directions of where I might be able to find out more about that and how to do it better?
I'm thinking about the work of Peter Jones and, what's it called again? His approach.
Privacy.
Dialogic design, systemic dialogic design, I think. It's a very technical approach, but they have a very structured approach of bringing people together around a complex problem and then getting them into sessions where they are doing foresighting, which includes thinking about how systems might work, right? So if you're talking about experimentation in your mind, it doesn't just all have to sit in your mind, you can talk about it. Birger Sivertson, who I showed on the screen, he always says, well, people just need to learn how to use their fantasy, and their imagination, because they are, you have to think beyond the things that we already know. So that means you have to set up the scene for that. And there's so many different collaborative techniques out there to get people to start thinking in different ways. I'm just thinking there's the Systemic Design Playbook, which is a nice resource, I think. The Systemic Design Playbook has lots of different... No, is it Systems Thinking Playbook? Do you know it or not?
Is it the black one with the rabbit? It's systemic.
So it has all these activities.
It's on the MailChimp.
Oh yeah, it has all these different activities in it that you can actually play with people to get them to understand how systems behave. So that might be a nice one.
There's also that, is it Convivial Toolbox?
The Convivial Toolbox, yes.
Finding front end.
Yeah, oh no, we do that actually a lot. So we, it's where you use 3D materials. You can also use collages, and you get people to think about, what's your ideal future state, and you get them actually to build that dream, that ideal future state. But then you also get them to talk about it, and you get them to talk about it in groups. So that's one of the techniques described in that book, the Convivial Toolbox. They're called generative tools Liz Sanders was here last year.
So Liz Sanders was here last year, and her talk is on our YouTube channel. So she'll talk about it there if you are interested.
I'm spoiled for choice here.
Yeah, there's another couple I'm thinking of right now. So Paul Pangaro has a whole approach. So he's a cyberneticist, which is a pretty classic systems thinking talking. But he's applying that to design and looking at with Hugh Doubly as well. But they've looked at design as a series of conversations, like kind of cascading conversations. So, and I find that fascinating because really, like, you don't have to make a thing or draw a thing to make progress and iterate and work out the constraints of something. Like, you can think that through in your head. And I think a pragmatist view is that an idea and a thing are the same. They move and evolve the same way. So
you do get very different conversations though when you start visualizing
Making's
stuff.
definitely better because you know you're at least talking about the same thing.
Yeah. That's what I learned about giga mapping. That giga mapping is actually not so much about drawing the map. It's about the conversations that you have about the map. So it's really a temporal thing, and that something that can evolve. But yeah, when you get people to draw stuff, they start pointing at things, and so you get a very different conversation.
Okay, we've got another question coming down from the back here, and now it's another question from the back as well.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating. Talking about the shifting the world view level, which is obviously a powerful place to work, but I guess the question I had was, like, how do you know whether the group you're working with can go there? And because some people have got different capacities to sort of deal with these things, and I'd just be interested to hear how you know that, and how do you know when you shifted that? And do you go through a process? Like, I've heard about, there's an interesting thing I've worked with in my studies. Sahel Initala has this causal layer analysis, which is very similar, where you actually take people through a process, but he doesn't always do that in a certain order. He just seems to have this amazing knack of knowing, and I don't know, it just seems to be more of an art than a science. And I just, any wisdom that you have on how to read a group to understand whether going to the worldview level is going to be okay for them, not kind of like unstabilise them, or kind of just not be, like, just fizzle, if that makes sense.
I would say that's probably the art of facilitation. And I have the privilege of working with a lot of people who are very experienced. A guy, Mike McCallum, who studied under Sahir Natala. And so he always uses that framework, actually, when we're in workshops and we are talking, and he'll turn around and say, they're at this, we need to get them down to the myth level, but they're just talking about, I can't remember the name of all the levels, but the top one where they're just talking about kind of that, what do they experience, what can they see, rather than write down like what are the fundamental kind of things underneath. And I mean, I think it takes a lot of practice. Like, a lot of people think facilitation is this thing, as soon as you know how to like talk in front of people, you're a good facilitator. It's a very difficult art.
I interviewed a number of people about facilitation in the past 6 months because I'm really interested in how we work together and kind of the skills that we need. And one of the things that Peter Jones talked about, but also Cheryl Dahl, who's this amazing woman who founded The Future of Fish in the US. They have a very careful process of inviting people to a workshop in the first place. So they don't just invite people because they work for a particular organization. They first of all look at who really needs to be there, and then they also interview these people before they actually run the session to find out kind of if they're suitable, but also not just on an individual level, but also how they relate to each other. So, in order to create this kind of safe space, you need to, for example, make sure that, you don't have competitors in the room, or if there's very strong hierarchies. So these are all things that are going to prevent people to open up and to talk about the things that you want them to talk about. And then there's a definite craft to facilitation. That's not just a matter of tools and techniques. That really, it's very interesting to watch if people do it very well. But Yeah, I think you really need really experienced facilitators to be able to do it. I do facilitate sometimes myself, and I like doing it. But you know, we've all been in those situations where there's people there who just don't wanna move or don't want to talk about their feelings or, you know, their perspectives. So yeah, it's a very important point actually in systems thinking.
And that is a lot of the work of designing systems. So workshops are a classic way to elicit constraints of a system or to get people to cohere around an idea. And I think, yeah, it is a critical point. And I've worked in a few places that have been very good at that. Second Road was one. And in our organisation now, Axillo, we do spend an enormous amount of time prepping for big workshops, particularly the big ones where we might have 100 clients coming. We have selected who is at every single table and which facilitator is going to be with them. What do we do in the setup? What is the pre-reading material? And who might be an issue? So we can make sure the best facilitator is on their table, and then we're constantly in all the breaks talking about what's happening, what might be happening. What do we need to think about? Should we reshuffle people around? Because you can do that. Just come back and say we're all sitting at different tables now, because we thought that something might become an issue. Yeah.
I was just thinking of this video that Cheryl Dahl posted on her website. So she works for an organization called Flip Labs, and she has a number of 3-minute videos about how to run sessions like that. And one is about that you don't invite people who suck, basically. So make sure that you don't have those people in the room, because that's going to have a massive impact. And it's very simple, but it kind of makes sense. So you need to find out if there are any people like that, and if they're going to be there or not.
I think my question is a good follow-on from the discussion that we've just had. Thank you, Jax, for organising this, and thank you both for your presentations. I think it's really important to think about how we shift from designing solutions to very prescribed issues to bringing a systems thinking approach to designing social solutions. And I think we're starting to get at the nub of the problem, which is that we do not design in an equal playing field. We actually have to understand and talk about power relationships. And a lot of the discussion this evening has assumed and not spoken that there is an explicit funding body and authorising environment for the design work that's being done, and that the design work will have an outcome, and that the authorising environment has agreed to implement it. And following on from that, there is a boundary setting about what you're allowed to talk about, who you're allowed to invite, how comfortable you feel with how they behave when they come, and how human-centred you're actually being in the work that you do. So I think it's really important to do a couple of things in this space. To really think about the context that people who are living difficult lives, which I don't think anybody in this room is actually doing. We're all interested in helping, but we're not living the experience. So how do we understand, express empathy, pay respect, and how is it possible for us to create situations where we can deal with where the power sits and build capability to shift paradigms so that you can actually look at legislative funding and other really large-scale mechanisms, which are the things that we need to do if we're not just going to put another pretty, well-designed, well-presented Band-Aid on the kinds of things that we all want to deal with. Now that's been a bit of a rant. That's what I bring to this context, and I'm really interested in how you struggle with this, because I make an assumption that you do.
No, thank you for mentioning that. Also the funding mechanisms that fund their programs, and to make sure that they get what they call, what's it called? Ashby's law of requisite variety. Do you know the law? So this is law that says that, you know, the complexity of the extent of the complexity of the problem needs to be represented in the room, and there are particular rules about you know, who you should invite, who should be invited in the room. And then and whose room is it anyway? So that's interesting. Like, where are you meeting, and those kind of things. And Cheryl Dahl also changed her funding mechanism of her initiative. So in the Future Fish, they were looking at the sustainability of fisheries. And eventually she decided to start her own social enterprise, which she calls a systemic incubator. Where she's looking at, well, you have this, you know, really complex system of sustainable fisheries which goes across the world. But there's all these different actors within this system that can make a difference, and all together they can make a difference, but they kind of need to know how they're connected. So she basically invites all entrepreneurs, it looks at an entrepreneurial level, and gets them to systemically look at the complex problem, and then they kind of support them through their funding mechanisms to actually implement those solutions. But it's not just one entrepreneur, right? There's this whole system of entrepreneurs, and they help those different entrepreneurs to write funding proposals, so they get their funding through all their different channels. And I think something like that already opens it up. It's almost a more systemic funding mechanism. So these movements are very interesting because they go away from the idea that, you know, there's a funder, there's a consultancy, and then there's a problem, and then there's some disadvantaged users there who get to, you know, be involved in some kind of co-design, and then kind of the funder decides what's going to happen. And it's also always going to be a complicated way of looking at the system. So I think it's a really great question, and I think I'm really interested to monitor what's going to happen and which direction it's going.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's no designer who's designing in a vacuum. So they're in a context where they're more than likely dependent on a wage coming from someone who wants them to do a certain thing. So, I mean, most of the time you have a certain amount of scope to do things that you really value, I guess, and do push the change that you really want to see. But I think you should actually reflect a lot on that and what your values are as a designer and what kind of things you want to see. And I mean, you can be paid a lot working for some kinds of organisations, but and that's totally fine if that's your thing. But choosing where you work and what type of design projects you want to work on, I think is you're voting with your feet, and you can actually find like-minded people who care about the same things as you. The world is very, very big and complex, and I think, yeah, just think about who you're acting on behalf of and what scope is there in any design project to move things a little bit further to the direction that you think things should go.
The With Forward case study I did studied in Vancouver is a really interesting model because they were super invested themselves. They started with a 3-month ethnography, living with people with a cognitive disability, and they did it pro bono. So they did find a partner, but they said, well, you know, let's all invest. We're equal partners. You're not the funder, and we're not the consultancy. We're equal partners. So the service organization they worked with, they provided an apartment for them to live in the estate with people with a cognitive disability, and I think food, but that was all. Outside of that, they did it pro bono. And then they also started implementing themselves. So they set up a social enterprise themselves to implement this particular platform, then seeking for funding through different channels. And they're still ongoing. So this project ran, I think, 3 years ago now. And they just keep going. They're super engaged in this project, and I have a lot of respect for that. I can't imagine doing something like that myself, but you do see that is very effective, And it works very well for the people with a cognitive disability, because actually they even hired those people on their team to make them an active part of their team, and they gave them particular roles. So there are different ways of working, which I find very, very inspiring.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap. Thank you. Before we do so, I'd just like to big shout out to the Social Design Sydney team, to Kay Morahan, Suzanne Brown. We've got a new person who's helping us tonight, so Tim Nguyen, put your hand up, say hi. And Craig Brown, who does the video. Thank you also, Mark, all of you. And also, don't forget, we're going to have some videos online soon. Join our e-newsletter list. We're on Facebook too. Once they're up, we'll post it on Facebook and the next e-newsletter before the next event. Thank you all for coming, and see you soon.